My daughter sold my priceless collection for her wedding, calling it junk. I just smiled, attended the party, and waited for my special guests to arrive. My daughter called me with a cheerful voice, "Dad, surprise. I'm getting married next week." What she didn't tell me was that she'd already emptied my workshop and sold everything I owned. She called my legacy junk. But what she sold wasn't junk. It was history. It was 30 years of blood, sweat, and innovation that saved lives on racetracks across America. It was the foundation of who I am, who I was, and who I thought she might become. Before we go on, like this video, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, because this story is about what happens when respect becomes the rarest currency in a world obsessed with quick profit and shallow success. You need to understand who I am before you can understand the depth of this betrayal. My name is Ethan Cole, and for 61 years, I've lived with grease under my fingernails and dreams in my heart. I run a small auto restoration shop out of my barn, or at least, I used to before my own flesh and blood decided my life's work was worthless scrap metal. People see a mechanic when they look at me. They see coveralls stained with decades of honest work, calloused hands that tell stories of engines brought back to life, and they make assumptions. They assume I'm simple. They assume I'm uneducated. They assume I'm beneath them. My daughter learned to make those same assumptions, and God help me, I blame myself for not fighting harder to keep her connected to who we really are. My late wife, Clara, she understood. She used to say, "You don't build cars, Ethan, you build memories." She'd watch me work late into the night, restoring some forgotten classic, and she'd bring me coffee and kiss my forehead. Every engine you touch, she'd say, becomes someone's first kiss, someone's wedding day, someone's last ride with their father. Clara knew that what I did wasn't just fixing machines, it was preserving pieces of people's souls. But Clara's been gone for 8 years now, and without her wisdom echoing through our home, Samantha drifted away from understanding what we built here. She got engaged to Marcus, an investment broker who wears suits that cost more than most people make in a month. His family. Jesus, his family looked at me like I was something they'd scrape off their shoe. When Samantha brought them to meet me for the first time, I cleaned up the best I could. I wore my good shirt, the one Clara bought me for church. I swept the garage, organized my tools, and even put out some of Clara's good china with fresh coffee. I wanted them to see that respect and dignity aren't measured by bank accounts. Marcus's mother walked into my workshop and actually pinched her nose. "My goodness," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "how do you stand that smell?" She was talking about the honest scent of motor oil and metal polish, the perfume of American craftsmanship. And my daughter, my beautiful, brilliant daughter who used to sit on my workbench as a little girl, asking me to explain how engines breathe, she laughed. She actually laughed and said, "Mom, Dad's got all this dusty museum junk everywhere. Don't worry, we'll clean it up eventually." Museum junk. That's what she called the 1970 Firehawk replica I'd spent 3 years building from the ground up. That's what she called the vintage torque tools my own father passed down to me. That's what she called the bronze prototype carburetor that revolutionized street performance engineering, a piece that belonged in the Smithsonian, not gathering dust in some rich collector's private showcase. But I smiled. I nodded. I poured their coffee and listened to Marcus explain how he was going to elevate Samantha's lifestyle and help her leave her blue-collar past behind. Every word felt like a nail hammered into my heart, but I smiled because I loved my daughter and wanted her to be happy. I should have known what was coming. The signs were there, the way she avoided eye contact when we talked about the wedding expenses, the way she changed the subject whenever I mentioned helping with costs, the way she suddenly became interested in asking about the value of my collection. But I was blind with love and grief and the stupid hope that maybe, just maybe, she still had some of Clara's wisdom buried deep inside her heart. A week later, I walked into my garage and my legs nearly gave out. Empty shelves. Empty floor. 40 years of collecting, building, and creating, gone. The custom-built 1970 Firehawk replica that I'd been featured in 3 different automotive magazines for restoring, vanished. My vintage torque tools, some of them dating back to the 1940s, disappeared. And the bronze prototype carburetor, the crown jewel of my collection, the piece that represented the pinnacle of my engineering career, missing. I stood there in that hollow space, and for the first time since Clara died, I cried. Not the quiet tears of missing her, but the raw, ugly sobs of a man whose very identity had been stolen by the person he loved most in the world. The echoes in that empty garage sounded like mockery, every footstep, every breath magnified in the absence of everything that made me who I was. Then my phone rang. Dad? Samantha's voice was light, casual, like she was calling to chat about the weather. I had to sell some of your old stuff. The wedding venue needed a deposit, and Marcus's parents insisted on the Regency Grand Hotel. You understand, right? It's just collecting dust anyway. Just collecting dust. 40 years of passion, innovation, and craftsmanship. Just collecting dust. I couldn't speak at first. The rage was so pure, so complete, that I forgot how to form words. When I finally found my voice, it came out as a whisper, "You sold your childhood, Sam." "What do you mean?" she asked, and I could hear the genuine confusion in her voice. She really didn't understand. My own daughter had become so disconnected from our family's legacy that she couldn't comprehend what she'd just destroyed. "I mean, you sold the garage where I taught you to change your first tire. You sold the workbench where you did your homework while I restored classics late into the night. You sold the tools that built the engine in your first car. You sold your grandfather's legacy and your father's dreams for a fancy party that'll be forgotten in a week." "Dad, you're being dramatic. It's just old car stuff." Marcus says. Marcus says. I had to stop myself from saying what I really thought about Marcus and his opinions. "Sam, do you even know what you sold? Some tools, some car parts, that old bronze thing you kept on the shelf. The collector paid really well for that piece. He seemed to think it was important or something. That old bronze thing. The carburetor that took me 2 years to design and another year to perfect. The innovation that made racing safer for thousands of drivers. The prototype that launched a career she never bothered to understand. Who did you sell it to?" I asked. "Some doctor guy. Rhodes, I think. He has a private collection or something." "Dad, why are you making this so difficult? It's just stuff. Just stuff. My life's work, just stuff." After I hung up, I sat in that empty garage until the sun set. I tried to remember every conversation I'd had with Samantha about my work, every time I tried to explain the importance of what I did, every moment I'd hoped she might follow in my footsteps. And I realized with devastating clarity that I'd failed her long before she betrayed me. I'd failed to make her understand that what we do with our hands, what we build with our hearts, what we leave behind for the next generation, that's what makes us human. But I'm not a man who stays down long. Clara taught me that, too. When life knocks you flat, she used to say, you don't just get back up, you figure out why you fell and make sure it never happens again. So I began investigating. Not with anger, anger makes you sloppy. With the same methodical patience I used to diagnose engine problems. I started with Dr. Alan Rhodes, the collector who bought my carburetor. A simple internet search revealed that he wasn't just any collector, he was the curator of one of the most prestigious private automotive museums in the country, specializing in engineering innovations that changed the industry. Through local auction sites and online marketplaces, I traced every single item Samantha had sold. My vintage tools were scattered across the country, sold to collectors who understood their value far better than my own daughter. The Firehawk replica went to a restoration enthusiast in California who'd been searching for exactly that model for years. But the most painful discovery was how she'd managed to sell everything so quickly. Digital signatures. Forged authorization forms. She'd used my name, my reputation, my identity to authenticate the sales. My own daughter had committed fraud using my legacy as collateral. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I walked to an old filing cabinet in the corner of my now empty workshop and pulled out a dusty folder I hadn't opened in 15 years. Inside were blueprints, correspondence with the Department of Transportation, patents, and commendation letters from racing commissioners across the country. You see, what Samantha never understood, what I'd never been proud enough to properly explain, was that I wasn't just a mechanic who got lucky. I was the lead engineer who co-designed the first safety-certified racing carburetor in America. My innovations didn't just make cars faster, they made racing safer. The patents from my designs funded scholarship programs for underprivileged kids who wanted to learn automotive engineering. The bronze prototype she sold for wedding venue money had saved dozens of lives on racetracks. But I'd kept quiet about all of that. After the economic crash of 2009, when the racing industry contracted and corporate politics pushed out the innovators, I'd retreated to my barn and my simple life. I'd let the world forget about Ethan Cole the engineer and embraced being Ethan Cole the local mechanic. I thought humility was nobility. I thought letting my accomplishments speak for themselves was enough. I was wrong. And my daughter paid the price for my silence. I pulled out my old address book and found a number I hadn't called in years. Raymond Cross, retired racing commissioner, and one of the few men in the industry who truly understood the impact of my work. Raymond Cross speaking. Ray, it's Ethan Cole. The pause on the other end told me everything. Ethan Cole. Jesus Christ, I thought you'd vanished after the '09 crash. Where the hell have you been? I didn't vanish, Ray. I went quiet. Maybe too quiet. I told him everything. The betrayal, the theft, the wedding, the humiliation of having my life's work called junk by my own flesh and blood. With every word, I could hear Raymond's breathing getting heavier, his anger building on my behalf. You built the system that saved dozens of lives on the track, he said when I finished. The industry still uses your patents. Every racing carburetor manufactured today incorporates your safety innovations. You're a goddamn legend, Ethan, and your daughter sold your legacy for a fancy party. She doesn't know, Ray. I never told her. I thought if I stayed humble, if I didn't boast about the past, she'd learn to value the work itself over the recognition. I was wrong. Raymond was quiet for a long moment. Then, you say she's getting married this weekend? Yes. Then let's teach her what legacy really means. And Ethan? It's time to stop being humble about changing the world. What happened next felt like watching a master craftsman work. Raymond made calls to his network, automotive historians, former racers, journalists who covered the golden age of American motorsport innovation. Within hours, my story was spreading through circles that understood the true value of what had been stolen. Meanwhile, I had one more encounter with Samantha's future in-laws. They came to inspect the wedding venue, the Regency Grand Hotel, paid for with the proceeds from my stolen collection. Marcus's mother spotted me in the lobby and approached with that same condescending smile she'd worn in my workshop. Mr. Cole. How lovely to see you. You must be so proud that your daughter is marrying into real success. Marcus is going to take such good care of her, elevate her from where she came from. I looked at this woman, dripping in jewelry that cost more than most people's annual salary, talking about elevation and success while standing in a building paid for by stolen goods, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not anger. Not rage. But a deep, calm certainty about what needed to happen. "Ma'am," I said quietly, "success is measured in engines that run, not in egos that stall." She blinked, clearly not understanding the metaphor. "I'm sorry." "Engines, ma'am. The complicated machines that make everything else possible. Without them, all the fancy hotels and expensive jewelry in the world are just decoration." She laughed nervously and walked away. But she'd understand soon enough. They all would. Saturday afternoon arrived with the kind of perfect weather that makes people believe in fairy tales. The Regency Grand Hotel buzzed with activity as guests in expensive clothes sipped champagne in the marble-appointed hall. Samantha looked beautiful in her dress, Clara's pearl necklace catching the light around her throat, the same necklace I'd given her mother on our wedding day 32 years ago. For a moment, watching her laugh with her bridesmaids, I almost called the whole thing off. She was my daughter. My only child. The last piece of Clara I had left in this world. Did I really want to humiliate her on what should be the happiest day of her life? Then I remembered the empty garage. The casual dismissal of my life's work. The forged signatures and the stolen legacy. And I knew that sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is teach their child the consequences of their choices. A faint rumble shook the ground outside. The guests looked around, confused by the growing sound of engines. Through the hotel's tall windows, they could see a line of vintage cars pulling up to the entrance, each one a pristine example of American automotive craftsmanship, each one restored using engineering principles I developed. The whispers started immediately. Hotel staff rushed to accommodate the unexpected motorcade. Photographers appeared from nowhere, drawn by the spectacle of classic automobiles at a high-society wedding. Then Dr. Alan Rhodes entered the reception hall, carrying a covered display box. He was a distinguished man in his 70s, wearing a simple suit that somehow commanded more respect than all the designer outfits in the room combined. Behind him walked Raymond Cross, still imposing despite his retirement years. The room gradually fell silent as Dr. Rhodes approached me. "Mr. Cole," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, "you left something unfinished. I believe this belongs to you." He placed the box on the nearest table and carefully removed the cover, revealing the bronze carburetor mounted on a custom display stand. But it wasn't the same piece my daughter had sold. This one had been restored to museum quality, with a brass nameplate that read, Cole 1.0, the prototype that changed racing forever. The gasps were audible. Camera phones appeared like magic, flashing as guests crowded around to see what could possibly be so important. Samantha stared from across the room, her face a mask of confusion and growing dread. Raymond stepped forward, his voice trained by years of speaking to crowds at racing events. "Ladies and gentlemen, you're in the presence of the man whose innovations made American motorsport safer for 30 years. The carburetor you're looking at represents a revolution in racing safety technology. Its designer, Ethan Cole, saved more lives on the racetrack than any single innovation since the invention of the safety belt." The room erupted in murmurs. Guests who had dismissed me as Samantha's blue-collar father suddenly looked at me with new eyes. The society reporters in attendance smelled a story bigger than a simple wedding announcement. But I only had eyes for my daughter. Across the room, Samantha's face had gone white. The reality of what she'd done was finally sinking in. She'd stolen and sold a piece of American automotive history. She'd committed fraud against her own father's name. And she'd done it all to pay for a party celebrating her escape from the very legacy that had funded her entire life. Raymond wasn't finished. From his briefcase, he produced a folder of documents, the forged signatures, the digital transfer records, the proof of fraud that I'd uncovered during my investigation. Behind him, a local deputy sheriff entered quietly, having been alerted to the situation by Raymond's contacts. This carburetor, Raymond continued, was sold without Mr. Cole's knowledge or consent. Along with an entire collection of vintage automotive tools and a restored classic car worth more than most people's homes. The sales were facilitated using forged authorization documents and digital signatures. Marcus's mother actually fainted. The sound of her hitting the marble floor echoed through the suddenly silent reception hall. Hotel staff rushed to help her while Marcus himself looked like he wanted to disappear into the expensive wallpaper. I walked slowly to the center of the room, every eye on me. When I spoke, my voice was quiet but carried clearly to every corner of the hall. "You called my work worthless," I said, looking directly at Samantha. "You called it junk, clutter, stuff that was just collecting dust. But the patents from those designs fund scholarships for kids who build, not buy, their future. The innovations you sold as scrap metal save lives every time someone races a car safely on an American track." I turned to the deputy, who had been listening to everything with growing understanding. "Deputy, I'm not pressing charges, not today. My daughter made a mistake, but she's still my daughter. Let her rebuild what she broke. Let her learn what legacy really means." The deputy nodded, but I could see him making notes. The threat of future legal action hung in the air like smoke. The wedding continued, but it was a hollow affair. Half the guests left early, uncomfortable with the drama and revelation. The other half stayed to whisper and stare, treating the reception like a spectacle rather than a celebration. Samantha barely spoke to anyone, including her new husband, who spent most of the evening fielding angry calls from his parents about being associated with thieves. I left before the cake was cut. I couldn't bear to watch my daughter try to celebrate while drowning in the consequences of her choices. Dr. Rhodes walked me to my truck, the bronze carburetor carefully secured in a protective case. "Mr. Cole," he said, "I want you to know that your work belongs in my museum, but only if you're willing to be properly credited. I spent 15 years looking for documentation on the Cole innovations. The racing community thought you were a myth. I tried to be invisible," I admitted. "After the industry politics and the corporate takeovers, I thought quiet dignity was better than fighting for recognition." "Sometimes," he replied, "the most dignified thing you can do is refuse to let your legacy be forgotten." He was right, of course. My silence hadn't protected anyone. It had only made it easier for my life's work to be dismissed, stolen, and sold. Humility without education is just another form of abandonment. The weeks that followed were a slow, painful process of rebuilding, not just my workshop, but my relationship with the world and my place in it. Raymond's contacts in the automotive journalism community started reaching out, wanting to interview the forgotten innovator, who had emerged from retirement. Dr. Rhodes arranged for several of my prototype pieces to be displayed in his museum, with full attribution and historical context. But the most important rebuilding was happening with Samantha. 3 weeks after the wedding, she appeared at my workshop door. Her eyes were red from crying, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. In her hands, she carried a small wooden box. "Dad," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I don't know how to fix what I did." I invited her in, made coffee the way Clara used to make it, and listened as my daughter finally told me the truth. The financial pressure from Marcus's family to have an expensive wedding. The shame she felt about our modest lifestyle compared to their wealth. The gradual erosion of her connection to who she really was. "I convinced myself that your work was holding me back," she said. "That if I could just erase where I came from, I could become someone worthy of Marcus's family. But the truth is, I was never ashamed of you, Dad. I was ashamed of myself for not understanding what you'd built." She opened the wooden box and pulled out a small bronze wrench keychain, clearly custom-made. Engraved on it were the words, "To the man who builds, not for profit, but for purpose. I took the keychain, feeling its weight, not just the physical weight of the metal, but the weight of my daughter's attempt at redemption. It wasn't enough to undo the damage, but it was a beginning. "Engines don't last forever, Sam," I said, putting my arm around her shoulder. "But legacy? Legacy runs on respect. Not just respect from others, but the respect you show for what came before you and what you'll leave behind." She started volunteering at an automotive education charity, working with teenagers who were learning to restore engines and understand the mechanical heart of American craftsmanship. She'd call me every few days with stories about kids who reminded her of herself at that age, curious, eager to learn, hungry for connection to something larger than themselves. The local newspaper ran a feature story, "Forgotten Innovator Reemerges, the Mechanic Who Changed Safety Forever." The article included photos of my workshop, interviews with racing legends who had used my innovations, and a detailed explanation of how my safety modifications had prevented countless accidents over the years. The response was overwhelming. Former colleagues reached out, racing fans sent letters, and the community college offered me a position teaching automotive engineering to apprentices who couldn't afford traditional four-year programs. But the real healing came 6 months later, when Samantha visited my workshop, now restored, reorganized, and alive again with the sound of work being done. She brought Marcus with her, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked genuinely interested in understanding rather than judging. "Mr. Cole," he said, examining a carburetor I was rebuilding, "Samantha's been teaching me about your work. I had no idea about the engineering complexity involved. My background is finance, so I usually think about value in terms of dollars, but this." He gestured around the workshop. "This is about something more important than money, isn't it?" I smiled, thinking of Clara and how proud she would have been to see this moment. "Marcus, every engine has a story. Every restored car represents someone's dreams, someone's memories, someone's connection to the past and hope for the future. What we do here isn't just fixing machines, it's preserving the human spirit that builds things with purpose." Samantha handed me a new bronze nameplate she'd had made for my workbench. It read, "Ethan Cole, Engineer, Innovator, Father." Below that, in smaller letters, "Where Legacy Lives." As I watch my daughter work beside me now, learning to use the tools she once dismissed as junk, I think about what Clara would say. She'd probably smile and remind me that the best legacy isn't what you build with your hands, it's what you build in the hearts of the people who come after you. The racing industry has welcomed me back with open arms. My patents are being updated for modern applications. The scholarship fund that my innovation support has expanded to help dozens of young people every year pursue careers in automotive engineering. Dr. Rhodes has asked me to consult on a permanent exhibit about American innovation in motorsport safety. But none of that matters as much as the moment when Samantha successfully installed her first carburetor rebuild and looked up at me with oil on her hands and pride in her eyes, finally understanding what it means to create something that lasts. If you've listened to this entire story, if you've stayed with me through the pain and the anger and the slow journey back to understanding, then you know that this isn't really about tools or cars or even stolen legacies. This is about respect, respect for the work that came before us, respect for the hands that build the world we live in, and respect for the truth that real value can't be measured in dollars or social status. My daughter called my work junk, but she was wrong. She was wrong because she'd never been taught to see the connection between the bronze carburetor on my shelf and the safe race that a young driver would complete using my innovations. She was wrong because she'd never understood that every tool in my workshop represented not just my history, but the history of American craftsmanship and innovation. But here's what I learned: being right isn't enough. Teaching respect isn't enough. Sometimes you have to demand respect, not for yourself, but for the legacy you carry and the future you're trying to build. Engines don't last forever. Patents expire. Tools wear out. But the respect we show for the work of human hands, the dignity we give to the people who build our world, the understanding we pass down about what really matters, that's the legacy that runs on something more powerful than gasoline or electricity or anything else we can manufacture. That's the legacy that runs on love. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below, because sometimes the quietest craftsman builds the loudest legacy. And sometimes the most important lesson a father can teach isn't how to use tools, but how to recognize the value of the hands that hold them. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for understanding why it mattered to tell it. And thank you for being part of a world that still believes respect is the rarest currency, and the only one that really matters. Now go build something that lasts.